Do you consider yourself a high achiever? Smart, driven, highly successful? I am so excited to have you. My name is Julia Arndt and I'm the host of the Stress Podcast. I will help you develop your stress resilience the same way you've developed your workplace superpowers. Learn peak performance tools to thrive at work and in your personal life. Let's get started. Hi, dear peak performer. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's podcast episode. My name is Julia Arndt and I'm the host of this podcast. And in today's podcast, I'm going to share a little bit more of sensitive information. So I just wanted to make sure to mention that if you are listening or watching this podcast episode today, this is a discussion about suicide and self-harm. So please be aware that this content can be sensitive and triggering. If you or someone you know is struggling with suicidal thoughts or actions, please seek immediate help from a professional mental health provider or contact a suicide prevention hotline in your area. Remember, you're not alone and there's always help available. So with that said, I hope that you find this podcast episode really inspirational and really helpful and really insightful. And if you have any questions for me or for Kealah after this podcast episode, obviously don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. We are always here to help you. And with that said, enjoy the podcast episode today, and I wish you a wonderful rest of your day as well. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Stressed Podcast. I am really excited to welcome a really special podcast guest to the show today, and it is Kealah Parkinson. Hi Kealah, how are you today?
Good to see you, Julia.
Yes, good to see you as well. I'm particularly excited to talk with you today, Kealah, because we are talking and we decided to talk about the topic today that's super important, I think, to talk about in today's world and society, and at the same time a very touchy-feely, sensitive, maybe even difficult topic to talk about. So I'm super honored that you said that you're very open and to talk about this today. And before we jump into that topic, I always like to ask 3 questions to kind of just warm up and get a little bit of an inside perspective into your life. And the 3 questions are: where are you located? What time is it? And what have you been up to this morning?
Okay, I am located in Northwest Indiana. It's a Chicago suburb. We're just underneath of Lake Michigan. It is 1:39 p.m. And this morning, all day actually, I have been out here in my podcast shed, my she shed, and I have been working remotely, sort of remotely, and connecting with people and really enjoying the quiet time while my children are homeschooled by my husband in our house.
Very nice. How old are your children?
They're 9 and 7, 2 little boys.
Oh, very cool. Tell us a little bit more about you and what you do today for work and how maybe you got there as well.
Sure. I'm a communications coach and I help people cycle out of fight or flight in the moment. So basically, when we are in fight or flight, something is panicking us. And I like to break it down into its 3 moving parts, I call them. It's our body, our moods, and our thoughts. And everything hits us at one time. There's not really a sequence to it, but I love to teach people how to break it down into body, moods, and thoughts using something I call the BMT index, where we really are just naming those things and having a self-assessment. It actually starts to access our higher level thinking and naturally stop us from being in fight or flight, right? So that little trick is so fun. And I typically work with small business owners and sales professionals, but since the pandemic, I've also been working with families of all ages.
Wow, amazing. Families, because they are trying to communicate better with each other?
Absolutely. And that's always the need for families, but right now, since the last few years, people are doing what we're doing. They're working from home, their families are with them. You're trying to figure out how to balance all the time and schedules. And then my case, then our children are home now. We started homeschooling during the pandemic and decided it works and kept doing it. And so there are a lot of people working like that, and that makes it even more challenging. So why not treat families as teams like we would a bunch of coworkers?
Yeah, I love that. That's such a cool idea. And did you always do that, or is it what is your background in?
Yes. So I actually have I studied journalism at Ball State University, and I actually was in the niche of magazine sequence. And so, it's funny. I say I did this great internship at Redbook, and some people, maybe you two, are like, "What's Redbook?" And I'm like, "Oh, my heart!" It was a great title.
I was just thinking, what is
Right?
Redbook?
Redbook. It was such a great title for many, many years, for decades and decades. But there's really just not a magazine industry. And I sort of was on the cusp of that. In the 1990s, I sort of fell into new media instead of going into magazines. And so then I started doing corporate production, started coaching people on speech writing and writing speeches for various Fortune 500 companies and for C-suite execs and for brand launches and all kinds of fun things. And just really decided in 2008 that I wanted to do something that only I loved. And I liked the arc of really helping people feel confident about when they were delivering presentations or when they were trying to ask for a raise or something like that. And so with that, then I started doing communications coaching and opened my own practice.
Mm-hmm. Wow, very cool. I actually didn't know that about you. So that's super interesting. Very cool. And so in today's podcast, we're actually going to shift gears a little bit, and we are going to talk about suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really important topic for the world. And I know for you in particular, for me in particular, because there's been a couple of suicides in Lake Tahoe, where I live, over the last year, just over the last year alone, of friends that I was able to, kind of connect with. And it's been opening my eyes to, first of all, see there's a lot of men in their mid 30s, 40s, so kind of midlife, that are taking their lives. And I've been really shocked about that knowledge and about that reality. And I think, I always wonder, how can we help people to not think that this is the only escape or the only solution that they have in order to deal with their problems. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you, and thank you so much. So Kealah, I know that you had a suicide attempt.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. When I was 23, I had finished this great internship in New York City. I had lived in East Village the summer I was 21. It was so much fun and really empowering, especially because I'm from a small town in central Indiana that has 3 stoplights to this day. So it was like night and day for me. So fun. And then I went back to Ball State University, which is a great university. And it's in Muncie, Indiana, right next to my hometown. And I came from NYC back to Muncie, and I had some things to finish. I had been offered a job in the research department for Hearst Magazine Company, which is, a top publishing company still. And it was so wonderful. And they were going to help me find an apartment or some temporary housing. And it was just such quick paced movement. I wasn't prepared to accept it. So I said no out of fear, went back home to where I was from, and then felt trapped. Like, how am I ever going to get from there to here now that I just said no to that great opportunity? And the bottom line was, I just didn't really feel supported. I didn't have the guides who needed to get me from there to there that I had a trust base with. And there were so many other things from, like, just the background of my life, some unidentified and unresolved trauma. I just had so much negative self-talk. Like, I had all these opportunities I wasn't capitalizing on, and I just turned it all within. Like, it's got to be me. I'm worthless. I'm a failure. And then it was so hard to be in Muncie and not know how I was going to fulfill this future I had, and struggle with some other just personal things that were happening, that I decided in my head I had this checklist of all the categories of life. And I felt like I had a big mark of a failure in all the categories of life. And I thought, what's the point of being on the planet? And I just decided that that was how I felt. I recognized that that wasn't okay. And I actually reached out to my parents and some other people and asked for some help. And what they did was what a lot of people do. They wound up saying, let's just go to the general practitioner. Let's take this 10-question questionnaire and see that you check for depression. And let's give you, what was brand new at the time, Prozac and Zoloft were the big things. And I got one of those. And it wasn't a good fit for me.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Did you go to your parents saying, I'm thinking about taking my life? Or did you say, I'm not feeling well and I'm really sad? Or like, what was that conversation like?
That's a good question. I actually called them in the middle of the night. I was having insomnia. I was at my apartment on campus. At the time, I think I was 22, and I had a, a year left of school, maybe. I think I had a semester left of school. And I was failing all of my classes. I was struggling to get out of bed and go to class. I would go to work because I needed to pay my rent. And I got that done. And I was struggling to go to class. And it was so hard for me to articulate what was going on. I was developing this insomnia and this depression. It was this back and forth cycle. And I started drinking wine and taking sleeping pills and thinking that would help me. And we know that that doesn't help the sleep cycle. It was make it worse, right? It was more pronounced. And these were the things that I had at my fingertips at 22. And so I had this night where I thought, I can take that bottle of wine in the fridge and I can take that sleeping pill, that packet of sleeping pills in the medicine cabinet. I can combine them and just not wake up and not have to deal with it. So it wasn't even yet that I want to kill myself. It was just, I don't want to wake up and deal with my life every day because I'm not doing it well. And so I called my parents very late at night, and they, didn't live very far from me. And I told them the thought I had just had. And I had been having undiagnosed seasonal depression. There's that siren, Julia. This happened to us last time we were recording.
I know.
I was having this, there's a great timing for this too. I was having undiagnosed seasonal depression at the time, or through my childhood, actually. It probably started when I was 5. So for me to feel like I just sleep a lot in the winters, this was that time of year, it was very normal for me, and it was very normalized for my family. But when I said to them, I just feel like I don't want to wake up at all, like not just, I would say I want to sleep through winter is what I used to say, which now I know really is pre-suicidal talk, even that. At the time, I didn't know that, and we just spent years not just accepting that as life, right? So it compounded for me. So then I said, I just don't want to wake up at all. And that scared me enough to call them, and it scared them enough to come to me and sort of just be with me through that evening and kind of get me through the night. And then, that was the plan that they came up with, was the best that they could do at the time. So I did get on the medication, and then I had a quick reaction to it wasn't the right just strictly antidepressants were not good for my system. And then I lost my filter to listen to myself, not act on impulse. With the medication also in my system, then I was very impulsive. I believed my thoughts. It was a very interesting experience. And so the next time I had that thought, I went ahead and I took a bunch of beer and a bunch of pills from my cabinet and some neighbors' cabinets. And I had a very, very serious suicide attempt that I'm very lucky to have survived. And it was about 6 months between those two experiences.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was the difference between the first time and the second time, right? Because one thing that I just wrote down was you had the courage to ask for help. You actually had the awareness to be like, this is really scary, what I'm thinking right now. I'm going to ask for help, because I think a lot of people don't even have that idea that's crossing their minds in that moment. So what was the difference between those 6 months where you were like, I'm actually going to ask for help? Did you feel like I didn't get the help that I needed, and that made me feel even more like a failure, and that kind of pushed you even more into that direction of attempting
really
suicide?
Insightful. I'm glad you're asking that clarification, because it's really true. I think that for sure the ability to stop and listen to myself, that objective observer kind of went away for me after about 6 months on the medication. That was my personal experience with it, right? And so that was really hard for me to know, like, these thoughts, they just make sense now. And I see an opportunity to do this. But also, I definitely had reached out for help, and this is where it got me, right? And so I just felt like, well, if this is all there is, and sadly, I've heard that recently from, teenage family members and friends, if I'm going to live like this all my life, and this is what it looks like, of just me having to be stuck in these feelings that come and go, that I have to take meds or Medicaid or therapy, what's the point of reaching my goals, right? And I think that we're going to talk about men in a second. I'll let you lead that. Next question.
No, it's so interesting to me. And thank you so much for sharing with us so openly, because I know it's a very sensitive topic, obviously. And so what happened after that suicide attempt and waking up and obviously realizing that you were still on planet Earth?
Right? Exactly. Yeah. That was the surreal part. And in some ways, that's sort of where my journey begins, like to get to here, because all of a sudden I was like, okay, now I'm in the hospital. I'm still here on the planet. I had a boyfriend at the time. We were in a fight. We were taking a break, right? And that was one of my failures, I thought, and
Mm-hmm.
he was a wonderful person. And he just recognized that something was very off with me. He saw me at a neighboring party that I was at my neighbors at a party, and he knew them too. And we weren't talking to each other, but we saw each other away from across the room. And I was putting on a good mask, was really
Mm-hmm.
good at putting on a great mask and acting like everything was fine. But he knew me enough to know that something was wrong with me. And so he came and knocked on I left the party eventually, and I had stolen, from their medicine cabinet, which was not like me. And I just
Mm-hmm.
was like, this is great, I'm gonna just have more and I won't wake up. And he came and was knocking on the door, and I was like, go away. And I had never done that to him before. And I was lying down in my living room, and I was already passing out. And I don't know about this part, but he said my words were slurring. And so he kicked the door in, and he called
Mm-hmm.
911, and apparently repeatedly, because I was in a blackout at this point, but I kind of
Mm-hmm.
came to. I was fighting with him physically, just taking the phone out of the wall. Like I was determined I was going to end my life, and no one was going to stop me. And
Mm-hmm.
that scene got worse because 911 kept calling back. They wound up tracing the call. He had to make 3 calls, and then 2 EMTs and a police officer arrived. And I kind of came to from my blackout fighting with 3 grown men. Like I was in a headlock on the ground, and I somehow twisted out of it and kneed a first responder in
Mm-hmm.
the groin. And I was just like, bring it on, buddy. And I was saying these things that I was like, what am I even talking about? Part of me was like,
Mm-hmm.
what's happening, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
was saying to them, because they were calling me the B word, they were mad at me, they were just trying to, get me. And I was like a thing to them in that moment. And
Mm-hmm.
my humanity responded, Julia. I remember this moment of just like becoming very lucid and saying, you think you're so strong and you're saving me, and then you're demoralizing me and calling me names, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you even know about me? And just like blasting this guy. And this amazing police officer just stepped between us and was like, you're right. I hear you. And everything changed. I remember looking into his
Mm-hmm.
eyes. I get cold chills when I think about it. Officer Mike, I don't know his last name.
Mm-hmm.
He talked me into calming down and going with him into the ambulance. He said, suicide is murder, and legally you are not allowed to kill anyone, including yourself. And it really sunk into me. I was 23 by then. It really sunk into me. And I cooperated and went into the ambulance. And I remember crying when I realized, first of all, how human he was being with me. And I asked him why he was treating me so differently from the others. And then he told me he had lost a son to suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so, that's why it gives me cold chills, because,
Yeah.
and then I started crying. I started crying when I heard that part. And I said, I'm so sorry I'm doing this to you.
Mm-hmm.
And which shows, the amount of empathy that I had too. That was the part
Mm-hmm.
that was so hard to live with for so many years, right? Because it was so unexplained to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I said, I'm so sorry I'm doing this to you. And he said, no, I think that's why I'm here with you. And it was just this really great moment, and in the whole craziness that happened, I remember that. But so then there was more drama. Then it was the emergency room and getting my stomach pumped, and I got combative again because people were calling me names again. That was very
Mm-hmm.
difficult. Knowing that it was difficult for them to see it and witness it, and that it was part of a protection, I have compassion for that. Even at the time, quickly afterward, I had compassion for that. Small town, I actually knew some of the people, who were in
Mm-hmm.
there working on me.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they had me stay on the general population floor for a few days. And they talked with me. They had a psychiatrist come and visit with me, and they wound up giving me the opportunity to agree to admit myself to the psychiatric unit, which was there at the hospital. And then that was a whole different, experience. It was very scary. It was like
Of
one flew
course.
over the cuckoo's nest, right? And I was like, I'm in
Mm-hmm.
here with crazy people, and I'm crazy. That's how it was. That's how I felt. It was so disorienting. And then
Mm-hmm.
realizing everybody there had their story. It was like the
Mm-hmm.
most real summer camp ever, because at the end of a couple of
Mm-hmm.
weeks, we were hugging and trading names, and I had a support group of people. And
Mm-hmm.
so support group became the theme for me after that, finding people I could identify with, in various
Mm-hmm.
ways. And then learning to trust medication again, to trust therapists and doctors and healers through that kind
Mm-hmm.
of experience. It was just this sort of arc for me for a while. And I
Mm-hmm.
wound up self-medicating, spending like 12 years, doing either on or off my medications, and or self-medicating with mostly pot and alcohol. And
Mm-hmm.
making poor choices, having more bad consequences, piling on more trauma, and
Mm-hmm.
eventually finding some therapists I could trust who could help me do maybe some esoteric things to help move energy out of my body and
Right.
look at, epigenetics and things I've inherited and all this whole big picture stuff. And that really spoke with me and made me feel finally seen and heard. And
Mm-hmm.
the bottom line for me has been my main takeaway that we can stop suicide now when we learn to really feel our feelings and trust our intuition.
Yeah. You know what I'm hearing a lot as well from your story is it's a lot of work. And I think that can sometimes be very scary too, right? To actually look at those demons and to face the things that are coming up for you and to share that with others as well, right? Because we think we already have kind of that crazy stamp.
Yeah.
And so to work through that. And I think so beautifully, right, when you were saying, when you actually went to that psychiatric clinic, you realized there were other people with their stories and you weren't alone. And yeah, I think, one of the most important messages that I do want to bring across today in this podcast is that you're not alone. And if you are listening to this podcast today and you feel like you've had thoughts like that, or maybe you've gone through different suicide attempts, know that you are not alone in the thoughts that you have, and know that if you can find just a little inkling of curiosity or courage or a willingness to live, that there's so much help out there and so many amazing tools available in order to get even through that most difficult time of your life.
And it literally is like in the palm of our hands because now it is in our contact lists on our cell phones, right? There
Mm-hmm.
are hotlines we can call in that moment, if you're feeling that way. I even since then I have, used various suicide hotlines in the moment, even if I'm just like, I don't think I want to kill myself, but I have no idea how to solve this problem, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
just don't know how to move past it. And it's been really amazing, the volunteers and what they do and how, for about 5 different calls I've made through about 20 years. It
Mm-hmm.
really heard and I appreciate that. And no one has ever, I think some people are afraid if I call and I talk about this, they're going to send an ambulance to my house, but
Mm-hmm.
that's never happened to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful as well. And that would have been my next question
Mhm.
about, do these thoughts come back, right? Because it sounds like, you mentioned you feel like you already had seasonal depression at a very young age. And as much as I understand from depression, which is obviously, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a therapist. I have been diagnosed with depression in the past as well when I went through my burnout.
Mhm.
But I know that depression, when they talk about depression, they say it's really it's different to burnout because it really is, more of a mental health disease where you where you just have really negative thoughts and you get into that cycle that is really, really difficult to get out of. So how has it been for you? And you already kind of alluded to it. You said you already called the hotline over the past 20 years, maybe 5 times. How do you manage it now? Do you
Mm.
still take medication? Do you see groups on a regular basis, right? Is it a little bit like the Alcoholic Anonymous, where you kind of go on a regular basis to kind of keep that work up?
Mhm. So one thing I also did was get sober. And so I am in
Mhm.
a 12-step program. And that's really helpful because then I have a weekly support network of people, who
Mhm.
have always had what we kind of call in that group a God hole, this idea that like our spirit is lacking or broken. We feel this like rend, like I don't fit into either my family or my
Mhm.
community or whatever group I'm struggling to fit into because the voice in my head is telling me, that I'm worthless, right? And wherever that message comes from originally, it becomes something we start to buy into. And so then the idea becomes like, I just want to escape these feelings. And so if it's
Mhm.
really easy to use medication in that way, whether it is like prescribed medication that we're misusing or whether it's street drugs like I was doing, then the concept still though is because I have to clarify that when I was addicted to pot, first of all, that is something we can be addicted to. And second of all, it
Mhm.
was not legal anywhere in the country when I was, when I
Mhm.
was really struggling with this, right? So I definitely was not, I told myself I was using it to manage my moods, but I was over reliant on it. And I wasn't
Mhm.
trying to manage my moods first, right? It wasn't like I
Mhm.
could say, this will take the edge off. I do
Mhm.
still have a blood pressure medication that I use, PRN, and it just works on my central nervous system. So it doesn't get into my brain chemistry because
Mhm.
it's just blood pressure medication. And so I really appreciate that because I don't feel the effects everywhere. It doesn't get me confused about who am I? What's me? What's my medication? Which
Mm,
was a challenge for me before. And
mhm,
so I really appreciate just being able to work on my own central nervous system. And I have to say that even the last 3 years during the pandemic, I've maybe taken that 6 times. I mean, like, so I have a
mm,
very low dose of it.
mm,
And I really work on just grounding myself, breathing, doing things
mhm,
like the BMT index, using
mhm,
certain tools to help myself, and meditation and self awareness, and
mhm,
just and talking to people, being in that 12-step group. I
mhm,
also, for a few years through my journey, facilitated and was trained at the Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, which is headquartered in Chicago, and it's national around the United States. And I got really great training there on
mhm,
being able to talk to somebody, recognize the pre-suicidal signs, and have a conversation with someone to help them, agree to not act on those thoughts and to have a B plan. And for me, I have what I call a kudos bin of like the, awards and things I've won. And there is this green folder. And it was what I was released from the hospital psychiatric unit with all my brochures and my medication management schedule and all those phone numbers from my surreal summer camp friends. Right.
mhm,
And I also had like a pressed flower that my friends had brought me. Right. And I
mhm,
had all these memories and cards from people who had come to visit me, who had done something scary for them by visiting somebody in a psychiatric unit, which was
mhm,
scary for everybody, right? And just people I wouldn't have expected to see there. Like my babysitter from when I was 10 was sitting by my bed one day when I woke up, when I was in the general population unit. And then some guys that I, worked at like a fast food place with, there during college, they showed up and just we were like, doing the fist bump and being like, never again, right? Promise you'll never try this again. And I was like, why do you care even? I literally asked them, like, why do you even care? And they were like, we don't want to lose somebody we know, like you experienced.
mhm,
It's impactful to you. It's impactful to those of us who survive, even a friend of a friend, right? It's a hard loss, and it is a self-murder, and it's hard
mhm,
to witness, and it does impact us. And so
mhm,
that little folder stayed for me this promise that I would never act on those thoughts again, no matter what. And now with my 12-step program, I just use the same template of I have these thoughts, and this too shall pass. All feelings come and go. I'm
mhm,
allowed to feel these feelings. And then I look at the validity, because for me, I would think my feelings were ridiculous, and that
mhm,
didn't help me. Right. And so
mhm,
now I look at my feelings and I go, what's making me feel that way? Why am I feeling that way? And I look at the validity of that and I listen to myself. Right. And if I still feel
mhm,
kind of crazy, then I call someone else and I say, help me. And it's someone I
mhm,
trust, someone who's going to validate my feelings. And that's a
mhm,
really important piece for me of stopping the cycle.
mhm. Yeah. I was thinking, like, you kind of, summarized it so well, that knowledge is really power. And the more tools you know and the more people you know where to go to, that all of these things can help you through these difficult moments of having really difficult thoughts and really negative thoughts and feelings, which I think to an extent, you and maybe I'm super biased because I obviously also work with people that have experienced depression and that are taking depressants, and maybe I'm a little biased because of the line of work that I'm in nowadays. But I do feel like we all have had some kind of depression probably at some point in our lives, right? I just think about when you lose a parent, or when you um, separate from a boyfriend, right? Sometimes there are these really negative, difficult feelings that we are coping with, and it's a super difficult time, and maybe then these thoughts are coming our way, and we think that it's the last resort to basically take our lives and end it all, which is absolutely not, because I always believe that the biggest challenges and the biggest struggles in our lives actually bring us the most beautiful and the most powerful growth moments that we will ever experience.
Yeah. And the hard part is tolerating the distress, right?
Hmm.
Tolerating the discomfort, tolerating just something new and that we don't know the ending. And so you probably do the same thing, right? With my coaching clients, a lot of times I'm giving this challenge to sit with that, right? Tolerate the
Right.
discomfort that you're feeling. name it and just be with it and just feel what it feels like, and don't try to change it, don't try to manage it, right? Like, I don't mean like if you're really feeling like suicidal thoughts, right? Clearly I would never give that kind of advice, but to just be able to say, I can tolerate this distress, and see how far you can go before you need to shift. Does it pass on its own, right? Because so often we want to say like, somebody fix this for me, you know, and even if it's just, I'm going to go shopping or I'm going to Netflix binge or something, right? Like, it's self-soothing is okay, but when self-soothing becomes a crutch and we're not actually processing our feelings and our confusion, what you described, Julia, was grief, right? Or mourning, loss of a parent, loss of a relationship, loss of a job, right? Loss of an identity if we get a diagnosis, even, right? There's this mourning that comes with that. And that is valid, in my opinion.
Totally.
You're supposed to mourn those things, right? It's not it's about being a productive worker for someone else, right? And so the challenge is we have to feed ourselves, you know, we make these commitments to bills and things. And so being able to say, which distress do I want to tolerate, is really empowering too, right? Do I want to tolerate the distress of how trapped I'm feeling in this position and, you know, experience the burnout, right? Or do I want to tolerate the distress of like, maybe I'll move house and, you know, go someplace smaller or downscale in some way, right? Or move to a more affordable city or something like that. We're always getting to make those choices. And when we feel like we've lost the opportunity to make those choices, suicide becomes an option because we feel really powerless, and it's just one way of taking our power back, but it's not actually empowering, of course.
Yeah. And you're saying something super important that I want to highlight, which is when you are in that space of having these thoughts, and I want to talk a little bit about what can people do if they are having these thoughts, right? What are the first things that they can do? And we talked already about, obviously, these hotlines. We talked about reaching out to people that you trust and sharing, you know, taking that courage, which is super big courage, obviously, in the moment, to say, I am having these negative thoughts and feelings and I really need to talk to someone. Another thing that I just heard, and that's the one that I want to highlight, is what are the options that I have now, right? I'm feeling all of these different difficult feelings, and maybe I'm going through a difficult time because of the mourning or the grief, because something bad happened to me, no matter if it is the loss of a job or the loss even of a child, right? I know that that's obviously something that people have to deal with, unfortunately, sometimes too. And I really believe in journaling. I don't know how much
Yes.
you've journaled in that process and on that journey that you've had, but sometimes I find it even just writing down the thoughts or writing down what are my options, you know, to get a little bit out of that head, because that's actually something very similar to what you described earlier, that pulls you out of that emotional state and actually turns on your logical brain. And like even that little switch, even split seconds, can help you to turn off that amygdala, that fear and emotional response, and get back into a more rational brain.
Yes, I love that. And I love journaling as a tool so much. And I I had a tendency to go back and read, like, what's my journal for the year been like, right? What's my theme been? How am I growing? Am I still complaining about the same old things? And then I didn't realize that life is a series of patterns and that we will have the same challenges over and over. For a long time, I didn't realize that. But I did something interesting I think I was in my late 20s or early 30s. And I did something where I had a bunch of old journals and I just went through them, and I used like the color tab system, right? Like that you would do like flagging a report or something. And I just went through and I started flagging like my moods and kind of came up with this like arc, you know, and I just, in another journal, I just did like my own handwritten data graph. And it was like, oh, so this really matches seasonal depression. That was very helpful for me to understand. I kind of thought that, but when I saw that in black and white, you know, it was just like, okay, so what can I do proactively? So for me, some of the things I do is like in the late summer and early fall, I'm in the Midwest. And so the sunlight is going away. And that happens all over the US to a degree, right? But it's, you know, pretty pronounced in the Midwest. And so I start taking vitamin D supplements. And I started that with a nutritionist originally. And so now I know what the dosage is that is safe for me, because we don't want to get vitamin D toxicity, right? And so, you know, I have that, and it's something I start to do. And I use a full spectrum light also in the fall. And again, just I know when it feels really good, I use it for a little bit in the morning, and then I feel energized. if I'm having a really grumpy day, it's extra rainy or dark or whatever, stormy, like, let me just pop that light on for just 20 minutes and just feel, the vitamin D in my rods and cones and just remember what that feels like. And movement, always moving with purpose, right? And breathing. It sounds so simple. And honestly, it sounds so
Right.
dumb to so many people these days, right? But the breathing, I was stressed out just yesterday commuting somewhere with my children in the minivan, right? And just like hearing myself getting so irritated with them. And then I was like, whoa, this is not how I want to be talking to my children right now. And they're going to think it's their fault. And I'm not even mad at them. So I qualified that. And then I popped in my earbuds so I could just, tune out. I didn't even put any music on or anything. I just popped in my earbuds and they know that's a sign, like, give mommy space. And then it's how I take like some little personal space just for a minute, because we were all trapped in the car together. I couldn't walk away, right? And I started just breathing through my heels, just this idea of just like really elongating, the breath and feeling it with intention. And that small thing was so simple. And that wasn't my idea. I got that from a meditation teacher out of California.
Amazing.
And yeah, it's so great. It was so helpful and so recentering. And so I'm so grateful to just be able to pull these tools from all kinds of people and just use them in the moment. And then I don't even have to tolerate too much distress. I just recognize it and apply a tool.
Yeah. This is maybe a very personal question, and you can tell me if you don't want to answer it, but I'm kind of curious. Are you afraid of death? Because, I feel like a lot of people are that are maybe not depressed. And it always sounds to me like that the people that are having these suicidal thoughts, maybe they cope in a way better with death. So
Right.
I'm kind of curious, like how do you deal with these thoughts?
I love that question too. I think for a long time, I was very afraid of other people's death, right? I was afraid to lose people. And because I couldn't handle my own feelings about it. And that was the main thing. I was more afraid of that than I was of dying, I think. I think that you're really onto something with this, because I also think that a lot of people who are highly sensitive or overly emotional, all these things we kind of get labeled, are just really empathic people. And that's why I think that feeling our feelings and believing our intuition is really great, because it's all just information, right? It's definitely just information. It's one more piece of information that I can have. And when I believe it, I can really read a room so quickly. I can understand who to connect with. I can make great decisions when I trust myself and my gut and my intuition and my feelings, right? And when I've been told not to, it's hard to figure out how to live life down here, right? Like I feel very spiritual from the experiences I've had, including that one. I feel this deep connection to me, life is cyclical. It's one of my belief systems. And so I feel a connection to my relatives who have passed on. I don't necessarily like have conversations with people, but I do feel supported and not completely detached from them, right? There's just some connection there still. My little boy, my youngest son, he says that there's the souls are like the water cycle, that like, we come down into a body and then like we go up again, and there's like a whole water cycle thing.
Beautiful.
Like, I love that. I just love it so much. That resonates with me. And so I actually have I just had a 50th birthday and this year. And so I feel
Congratulations.
like, thank you. I feel like this is a great decade for just being completely honest, speaking my truth with love, sharing the story and the hard parts and the tools I've learned from it for all of us to help, and to do everything I can to die well. Like, that's my goal now. I'm like, if I'm lucky, I've got half my life left, and to be really honest with myself about that and not be afraid of it. My goal is to die well, to not die in disease if that's an option for me, and to live, the fullest, and to really be on my path and be committed to this, and to not die of suicide, not die of depression, not die of a physical disease, right? But I think it's an option. I had a great grandfather who died of natural causes at 89. And I was like, what's happening to him? And they were like, he's just shutting down. He's old. And I was like, but what's he dying of? And they were like, old age. And I was like, I don't get it. And it's an option, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's such a beautiful option. And I think that's such a beautiful goal to have as well, to say, I want to just be the best version of myself and the healthiest version of myself. And there was one thought that I had was also some books. about kind of these, you kind of touched a little bit on the spiritual side, and I do want to share two books, and I would love for you to share some books as well. Two books that just kind of came to my mind as we were talking about this is The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. Have you ever read that one?
I'm writing that down too.
I actually just mentioned it to my other podcast guest yesterday, and she had also not read it. And it's such a beautiful book because basically the brother dies in a car accident, and then he, goes away, and he starts to communicate with his sister and asks his sister to write a book about the afterlife, because there are so many ideas and so many, I think so many pre-notions of what the afterlife is, and he kind of wants to share that, and it's really beautiful. I really, really highly encourage readers to read this. Maybe even as, if you're feeling depressed, or even if you're having suicidal thoughts, it's a really beautiful book to remind ourselves of the beauty of life. So that's a really good one. And then if you want to go a level deeper into spirituality, there's a book that blew my mind when I first read it, and it's called Many Lives, Many Masters.
I feel like I've heard of that one, but I've not read that.
It's a very short book. I listen to a lot of my books because I just love listening to books when I drive. And it's like a 3.5, 4 hour book. And I remember listening to it on a drive, actually during my burnout.
Mm.
And I took like a week off, and I went hiking by myself in the mountains, and I was listening to this book as I got kind of to my little apartment that I stayed at for a week. And I was just like blown away by it, because it was also about how, about souls and how we live life. And I don't want to take it away. Just
Right.
read it if you're curious.
Good.
Yeah.
Love book recommendations. Thank you
Right.
for those. I'm
Yes,
excited
yes,
to
yes.
read them. So there are so many books really that have spoken to me because I am a word nerd, and I just, I'm a writer and I'm a reader and I'm a
Yeah.
communicator. I love
Right.
all. I have to say what's helping me the most right now is a book that I'm writing, and it is 365 Days of Mood Tools, actually full title to be completely determined, but hopefully will be out beginning of 2024 by Balboa Press. And it is a daily devotional for mental health consumers. And so every day there is the centering thought, there's a subject of impulsivity, perhaps boundaries, seasonal depression, the sunlight, all of that, the vitamin D. We talk about all of these things in there. And I say we because it's all the things I've learned from all the people who, I've been having these conversations with for the world. I'm not just writing it, I'm writing it from all these perspectives that are shared, that people have poured into me and shared with me, right? And I take that perspective of what's the common theme that I've learned from all of these support groups and all of these conversations and all of these things that are so helpful. And so every day I write from that centering thought in we language. And so it's right now I'm releasing pieces of it on Substack at buildbetterhumans.substack.com. It comes out every Tuesday as Tuesday Tools, and that's free.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's so exciting. And was there a book that you maybe read as you were going through that time in your life that really helped you?
This is the first thing that comes to mind. But when I was in still the main floor of the hospital, my cousin visited me, and she just brought me some reading material. She's a librarian, and she was like, "Here, read something. This is what you do when you have downtime." And I read Like Water for Chocolate. It was hot at the time, and it had just come out. It was a great award winner, and just the layers in that book, and the act of making with love, with feelings, with grief, with tears. That's what gives me cold chills too. The culture that was there, and the food, and just all of it was so beautiful to me. And it was inspiring. Like, I don't have to just live in this box I've been living in. There are so many ways to live, and I could really be an emotional person and have validity, and still be like a wonderful contributor. So like
what is it called? The Water for Chocolate?
Like Water for Chocolate.
Oh, Like Water for Chocolate. Okay. If somebody is listening to this podcast right now and they are looking for information on how to help someone that they know is struggling with that, what would you tell them to do?
Yeah. So I actually think that there is if you really feel like someone is suicidal, there's a script you can follow, right? And there are some general versions of it you can find online. If you Google suicide script, you can find the basic needs. And the main thrust is to connect and check in and to validate the feelings. And then what I was trained with DBSA is also to ask them to tell you their plan. And so you kind of have to tolerate your own discomfort. This is someone that you love, right? You're going to hear their plan for how they're going to kill themselves. And the goal is not to say like, okay, then I'm hiding all the guns or I'm throwing all the pills away, right? Like, no, the goal is to give them the autonomy to say then, you know, can you tolerate this discomfort just for tonight? Can you call me tomorrow, right? Can you promise you'll check in with me? Will you call the hotline instead of acting on this just for tonight? And just a small framework, just staying in the moment, being able to tolerate it. Yeah. And then saying like, and then you could say, I would feel more comfortable if you would throw the pills away, and I wouldn't watch you do it or something, because I don't want you to hurt yourself and not be able to come back. Because the main thing for all of us to remember is that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem.
I love that.
Me too.
And going back a little bit to the stories that I started to share at the beginning, as I mentioned, there was a suicide in my partner's family at the beginning of the year. There was another suicide, unfortunately, I think it was 1 month and a half ago, of a friend here in Tahoe that actually attempted suicide last year, didn't work out, and then committed suicide this year and unfortunately died. And then, I kind of can keep on going, unfortunately. And that was kind of that moment where I was like, wow, maybe it's because I'm living in this smaller community and more people and it's more intimate and you just hear more of these stories, because I'm absolutely sure that there's a lot of people in bigger cities as well, where suicide is probably, unfortunately, in a way, regular. I don't want to really say common, but a regular thing. And one of the things that I realized was men in, like I said, like in their 30s and their 40s, and they don't see any other solution than to take their lives. And that friend of a friend, he was in his mid 40s, was, I think, pretty successful, and also had 3 or 4 children that he left behind. And so I'm kind of curious on your thoughts about what the profile of people that are taking their lives, or maybe a shift that has happened over the last couple of years. And yeah, let's start with that.
Yeah, well, I want to say, so I just was reading some statistics yesterday, actually, for some writing I was doing, and 29%, right, of teens suicides have increased over the past 3 years, I believe it is. And so that sounds startling. That's great. We're really worried about our teens. Seriously, we are, right? Globally, however, the teens in the US are doing really well compared to a lot of other countries. And so that's surprising, because it's like, wow, how bad can it get? Because I just feel like most of the teens I talk to are struggling, right? It can be very pervasive. I think it was Brazil, where it was like 75% of teens were struggling with suicidal thoughts or attempts. Yeah, really, really high. In the US, the highest populations are people over 80. And think about that, right? If you lose your agency, what's the point? We've been talking about that the whole time, right? So that's actually the highest population. And the second highest is white males in that age demographic you're talking about, and particularly white males. And this concept of like, you have everything. What do you have to complain about? That's the message that a lot of these people are receiving.
Right.
And also, having been trained, a lot of people in that age demographic still don't express your feelings. Boys don't cry. Boys aren't sad. Boys aren't weak. You can't be vulnerable even by reaching out for help, like you've already, identified. It's scary to reach out for help. It's scary for anybody to do it. I reached out for help, and I had the people who were receiving me calling me names, right? Like, that was not cool. It wasn't cool. I don't begrudge them that was hard for them, and that was their job every day. And also, if that's going to happen, why do you want to do it? And then I had to pay for the ambulance. I was like, this is insult on top of insult after I survived, right? But like, that's how that works. And so it's a struggle to be able to be that vulnerable and to show that weakness and to know who to trust when you've been told the whole time, you have everything, you're supposed to be the strong provider. You're not allowed to break down and cry. You're not allowed to have these feelings. You're not allowed to grieve over people. You've just got to get going. You've got to be big and strong and soldier on. And
Mm-hmm.
3-year-old boys are still told this sometimes. It surprises me. I've got younger boys, and it surprises me that sometimes I'll hear some of our parent friends be like, big boys don't cry. And I'm like, oh, big boys can cry in our house. Like,
Yeah.
part of being a human.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's because they haven't seen it any other way, right? Either. So it kind of is just, I feel like, handed from generation to generation. And you're saying something so deeply resonating with me in the sense of like, they have everything, right? They are successful. They have a great life. They have maybe all the material things that they always wanted to have. They have a family, and yet there's something that's not right, right? And so I'm so glad that we're talking about this here, because I can relate to this in the sense of, when I was going through my burnout, I felt the same way, right? I was like, what am I crying about? I have this fantastic job. I am having a house on Lake Tahoe where I go to every weekend. I have the most beautiful life, right? People would watch my Instagram stories, which is another thing, right? Like that portrayed like perfect life. They would watch my stories or my posts and would be like, you lived the perfect life and you must be so happy. And I was so unhappy, right? I was so torn inside. And, I shared it with you on your podcast last week that I had self-harming thoughts, not suicidal thoughts, but definitely thoughts similar to what you were saying, in the sense of like, I wish I would just have an accident or something would happen to me, so I don't have to go back to this other life that I didn't really want to live anymore. And it took to have that thought for me to take the step to go to the doctor, to realize, okay, this is actually not normal, and I'm good.
Right.
It's good that I talked with somebody about this, right? And to make myself vulnerable. And I had no idea. Like, I really had no idea. I didn't know what was going on with me. I felt like a fraud. I felt super guilty. I felt super lonely. I felt bad for leaving my team behind, in a sense, because I decided to take a medical leave to take care of myself. But it made me, to be here today. It made me start my own business and do something that I feel more fulfilled with, live in an area that I love more. And there's no right or wrong. I think this is something that we oftentimes forget. Sometimes we check all of these boxes, right? The boxes that I learned as well when I was young, right? Like, have a good job, work for a great company, buy a house, right? Have a partner. And sometimes you check all these boxes and you're still not happy. And that's totally okay as well, because we are human beings and we are complex individuals. And sometimes, and oftentimes, I would say not even just sometimes, oftentimes we get to that point where we have everything and it doesn't make us happy. And that's totally okay. And we need to all figure out for ourselves what it is that actually is our choice and that makes us more the person that we actually want to be.
I love that so much. Nowadays, one of the biggest wisdom in the mental health spheres is that, even for providers, is that agency is the main healing component, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to have that autonomy of choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Wow, so powerful. Kealah, thank you so much for sharing so many insights with us today. Is there anything else that you feel like we haven't talked about yet, or that you want to mention or share here on the podcast?
Well, you were asking what tools people can use, right? And we did talk about the hotlines before.
Right.
Honestly, if you go to that website, if you're listening or watching and you go to that website, and you can just see those, right? And share with me, does this resonate with you? Is this helpful? I want this book to be out there. My goal is for it to be available on the psychiatric unit floor, people to take that agency immediately as soon as they get a diagnosis or whatever, or proactively buy it for your loved one who needs it, or for yourself, instead of, just managing these thoughts alone, right? So all of these things, and just knowing that whatever tool works for you is the tool that works for you, as long as it's not a harming tool, like drinking too much, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I'm glad that you mentioned that as well, that we oftentimes try to self-medicate, or we try to distract our feelings, right? And it can be anything. It can be drinking wine or taking drugs, or it can be porn or sex or gambling or retail therapy, right? Those are all very unhealthy coping mechanisms. And it's important to be aware of that and to call that out. And so one of the most important things that I do want to say and share today in this podcast is, if you have been listening to this podcast all the way to the end, and it is obviously a little bit of a heavy topic, please take a moment after listening to this podcast today to just let go of this energy and take care of yourself. Take a few deep breaths, go outside in nature. That's what I'm going to do now after this podcast episode, because I am a super sensitive, empathetic human being, and I tend to take on these energies and take on these stories that we just talked about. And I think it's so important to talk about it. And at the same time, I know I need to take care of myself in these moments, even more so to kind of let go of that negative energy and remind ourselves that that's a story, and those are stories, and they're really important to share. And at the same time, it's not our story, and our story can be different, and it's important to let go of that. Do you have any tools that you do to kind of let go sometimes when heavy, difficult conversations come up?
Yes. My favorite one is just earthing, right? Just putting my feet as flat as I can on the ground. I love, especially if I can be barefoot in the grass. That's my favorite thing to do, right?
Yes.
If not, even just in a pair of heels on an office floor, right? Being able to just have my feet as flat as I can get them on the ground. And then just imagining, the breath going through me. And I like to imagine that my feet have tree roots, and I'm just really, really grounded into Mother Earth. That feels so good for me. And we can do the simple technique also of like naming the 5 senses, right? 5 things I see, hear, smell, taste, touch. Just again, activating that higher level thinking for a second, and just knowing I'm on the earth. I have a friend who hers is even more simple than all of that. She just like stares at her feet for a minute. She just thinks about her feet. And so if that's the advantage, that's a great thing to do.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think that was important to mention as well, because I know myself and I know it's a heavy topic. So I would just want to make sure that we give that tool to our audience today as well.
Kealah, Julia.
Yes, it was really a pleasure. I'm so glad that we got to sit down and talk about this so important topic. And I hope lots of people are listening to it, and we can help a lot of people in this way. And if you have been listening to this podcast and you feel like, oh, I know someone maybe that should listen to this podcast, make sure that you share this podcast episode with them and that you take care of yourself. So thank you so much, Kealah, again, for being our special podcast guest today. I will share all of the different notes and links that Kealah shared with us today as well in the show notes, so you can have easy access to that. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Take care of yourself, and I can't wait to hear you again next week.